Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fifth podcast of Lash to the Mast. My name is Raphael Scribola, and let's start with a prayer, as we always do before study, by St. Thomas Aquinas. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, lofty origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your brilliance penetrate into the darkness of our understanding, and take from us the double darkness into which we have been born, an obscurity of both sin and ignorance. Give us a sharp sense of understanding, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Grant us the talent of being exact in our explanations, and the ability to express ourselves with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, and help in completion through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, we'll start with introductions as we always do. My name is Raphael Scribola. I am I was a student at the University of Michigan. I'm going to be returning in the fall as a senior, majoring in philosophy, economics, PPE, and cognitive science. And my favorite mystery of the Rosary is, I said the Assumption last time, but I would say it's a close between the Assumption and the Ascension. All right, I'll turn it over to Jacob now.
My name is Jacob Kubas. I'm a first year master's student at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków, Poland. And my favorite, studying history, my favorite mystery of the Rosary is the crowning with the crown of thorns.
Nice. All right, this is the two of us today, and we'll be talking about Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Hopefully, we'll go on extended rants, both of us. But this should be good. All right, I'll turn it over to Jacob now.
All right. Well, I mean, I don't really have much of a presentation that would be traditional to the podcast, but I thought we could have a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of back and forth about the role that Lord of the Rings has among traditional Catholics and in general among people of a more traditional worldview, whether that be politically or just in general, relative to how liberal-minded people and leftists treat Harry Potter. Um, and this might be a little controversial, but I think that's okay, and we can talk about it. Um, Generally, my thesis is that uh, just as it's annoying that oftentimes you get leftists who will talk about Harry Potter and they will reference everything in real life back to Harry Potter and nothing else. Harry Potter, or something else that is equally banal and consumerist. Um, and we were talking before the show um, about how back in during the Trump presidency there were comparisons to politics where it's like, oh my gosh, Trump is exactly like Voldemort or something like that. And it's like, I know what you're trying to say. I don't agree with it, but I know what you're trying to say. But there are other books out there. Pick up something else, read another book. And I have to say, sometimes I get that same feeling with people on our side of the political spectrum, or with people with similar worldviews to ours, and the Lord of the Rings and how they treat the Lord of the Rings. Where sometimes, sometimes we we get to the point where the Lord of the Rings and generally anything Tolkien, um, as good as it is, as big of a fan as I am, it's also gone to the point where it's like the only book that people on our in our camp reference.
Yeah.
And it's a great book. I love it. It's got a lot of value, and I think the message is a lot deeper than Harry Potter. I think the literary value of it is a lot greater than Harry Potter. So just so we're clear on that, um, and no one tries to crucify me or burn me at the stake or something for comparing Harry Potter to the Lord of the Rings or vice versa. I'm not doing that. I'm talking about the way that the respective fandoms treat it and reference it for everything. I think that really, just as we could say Harry Potter fans and leftists need to read other books than Harry Potter, um, right wingers need to reference other books than Lord of the Rings. I'm fairly certain they've read more books than Harry Potter fans do, and they haven't just read the Lord of the Rings. They've read other things, but they need to start referencing them too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I remember too the other book that a lot of leftists were referencing during Trump's presidency was 1984 by Orwell. Um, but yeah, I generally agree with what you're saying about fan bases being too into both sets of books. Personally, I've read Lord of the Rings maybe 6 or 7 times. I have never read Harry Potter, but I did have an extended discussion with my cousins are traditional Catholics as well as me, and they love Harry Potter. So I had an extended discussion with one of my cousins about it, and I learned a little bit about it, and it seems, um, yeah, it's I know there's the cliche about like traditionalists standing up and saying, "Oh, no, no Harry Potter, no yoga," that sort of thing. But I think in terms of with respect to Harry Potter, yeah, there are some questionable elements there. I think the main point I was making with my cousin was because he said in Harry Potter, basically there's this other world, this um, magic world, basically that is in the world but separate from kind of the real world, like it's invisible to normal people, and uh, this in this magic world, like people cast spells and do different sorts of magic, and you have to have it run in your blood. And one of the things that is in Harry Potter is that supposedly a lot of the witches who are going to be burned at the stake in the medieval times and all of that, those were like actually part of the magic world, and those are kind of ancestors or precursors to the Harry Potter, the I don't know, whatever the college is called in Harry Potter. They're kind of
Hogwarts. Hogwarts.
Hogwarts. Yes,
Yeah.
they're kind of a precursor to Hogwarts, and to me that's just a little bit objectionable because um, magic in the world is always bad. There's no
Well, it's interesting that you say that because during the Middle Ages, the church didn't really burn people at the stake for witchcraft. The church in the Middle Ages didn't really believe that magic existed. If you look at Saint Augustine, um, he basically says like people who believe in magic or who claim to practice magic, their their guilt is not that they practice magic; it's that their guilt is superstition. It's that they believe that they're practicing magic when they're really not.
Yeah, I mean either way.
Um,
Yeah, like either way,
but
it's bad. Um,
Well, I mean, in the Middle Ages in Catholic literature, you do get practitioners of magic like Merlin and things like that, characters like that that are portrayed rather positively. So, I mean, I think if there is a moral message in Harry Potter, then it's at least subconsciously a Christian message, and that's that good triumphs over evil. And in that way, I guess it's not the worst possible book that a child could read. Um, but would I give it to my kids? I don't know. I probably not. Mostly because I think there are better books to read, not because I find it particularly objectionable.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I would definitely have to take a look at Harry Potter more in depth because I have not actually read it. And yeah, I don't know much besides what my cousin told me, which that was pretty much it. Um, but yeah, I think like you were saying, turning over to Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is definitely a lot, you know, better than Harry Potter, and I believe in the 19th century, I think it was the second most sold book besides the Bible. Um, so it was
When? Sorry.
sorry, 19th, 20th century, not 19th, 20th century. I was thinking 1900s. Um, even though it was written like in 1962 or something like that. So it's a very very popular book. Um, and I think rightly so. But also, I think I agree with you that like the people who are really like nerds about it, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's a good book. It's a great book, but I think we should be focusing more on the message than on like, um, you know, learning everything about the Silmarillion, or just being able to rattle out different facts and stuff about it, different like all the different facts in the Silmarillion or whatever. I had because my
Well, I mean,
yes, go ahead.
I feel like that's one thing. I mean, but that's a very far extreme. I'm talking more about people who like will reference like everyday events or like modern politics back to the Lord of the Rings,
Oh,
as
interesting.
if that's their only like reference point in literature. And it's like pick up some Socrates, maybe some Homer. There are like there's like really good literature out there that isn't Lord of the Rings that you can reference and that agrees with our worldview. Um, and part of it has to do with like the meme culture, which I mean I love a good meme. I really do. Um, but a lot of the times, like I think in terms of like fiction in the right wing slash like traditionalist meme world, um, most of the references in the memes are back to the Lord of the Rings. But there's a whole world of, conservative or traditionalist fiction out there that we could reference in our memes and in other contexts as well that we don't.
Like Narnia.
And I think well, yeah, okay, whatever.
uh, yeah.
But I mean, but we don't, and I think we could diversify, and we could really benefit from that sort of diversification. Really, it would be a testament to our erudition, and it would
Yes.
encourage other people of our worldview or similar ideas to pick up those books if they haven't already.
Yeah. I mean, there's Dickens. There's Lewis. There's, uh, Orwell to a certain extent. Um, oh shoot, who wrote Brave New World?
Well, with Dickens, I'm not sure how much meme value there is to like starving orphans, but
Well, I mean, there's the Christmas Carol. There's Tale of Two Cities. Those are two pretty good books. And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of there is the same theme kind of showing up in a lot of his books in terms of starving orphans. That's true. But it is he is a very good writer. There's also yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of literature that, oh, I know another piece of literature that traditionalists are really really into is Jane Austen, the Jane Austen books. Um, and I've read Pride and Prejudice. I've read Emma. Um, I don't think I've read Sense and Sensibility, but Pride and Prejudice is kind of the main one. And yeah, it's sort of like, yeah, it's a good book, but it's very removed from like actual, present day sort of things. Like it's a very high class, like, you know, everything has to be perfect kind of thing. I don't know. It's just with Jane Austen, and I do get especially annoyed when people like kind of latch on to Jane Austen as like a sort of a model for contemporary courting or something like that. Because it's like it's not Victorian, but it's very like yeah, things have to
well,
be perfect
it's
or else.
Georgian. It's actually the Georgian era. The thing about Jane Austen is um, George the Fourth, who at this time was actually still the Prince of Wales, um, and regent for his father George the Third, who had actually gone insane by this point.
Oof.
Um, he was a huge Jane Austen fan,
Oh.
um, but Jane Austen hated him
Oh.
because she thought that he was like the epitome of like a spendthrift, um someone who just like was an empty aristocratic airhead, um, who spent a bunch of money needlessly. Um, and meanwhile, he was like trying to like be her royal patron, and it's like if you could sum up Jane Austen's relationship with George IV, it would be talented female writer struggles to beat off royal patron with a stick.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know that. Um, yeah, so I feel like Lord of the Rings, Jane Austen, those are the two kind of main genres that traditionalists like to, not genres, but um, Jane Austen and Tolkien. Those are the two authors that traditionalists really like to latch onto, and it's good to latch onto them to a certain extent. I just think, as with any piece of literature, like you can go too far into it, um, and just as you said, use it as like a reference point for everything else. Like, yeah, Jane Austen, or sorry, Pride and Prejudice is a really good book, but I don't think we should be going around with, you know, the suits of that time period and the just using kind of the, I don't know, like just sort of ridiculous in a way. Uh,
Well,
courting.
there's like a bit of LARP there.
Yeah, LARPing. There we
If
go.
you
That's the word I was looking for.
if you if you use Pride and Prejudice as like your go-to guide for how to court, then that's LARP.
Yeah,
We don't live in, the early 1800s.
yeah. And then going back,
Um,
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, but I mean, I was going to say like I actually think it's kind of surprising that you bring up Jane Austen, because I would never think of Jane Austen as like a typical trad book that trads reference back to. It's that seems I always consider Jane Austen to be like women's literature.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely like I know a family in our church. It's just like, or my old church, that's just really into it, um, and I think um, there's actually a board game that they got us for it, which I haven't played, but yeah, it's just that sort of thing, like LARPing. Like, I don't
Good to
know.
know that good to know that you actively use your Christmas presents that
No, it
other
wasn't
people
to me. It
thoughtfully
wasn't
got
to
for
me.
you.
No, no, no. It wasn't. The present wasn't given to me. It was someone else, and they play it. My sisters play it, but yeah, and there, my going back to Lord of the Rings, like my sisters are also taking a course, like a full year-long course, especially on the Lord of the, like literally it's just Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, which it's like, okay, I mean you can read up on the fact that the Hobbit was based on Beowulf, and there's a lot of like other tales woven into Lord of the Rings that Tolkien drew from, and he read poetic diction. What's that book called? Oh yeah, Owen Barfield's Poetic Diction, and a bunch of other things, but at the end of the day, like it's just a fantasy world. Like it's not, you know,
No, I disagree. I think like
really
the
okay.
idea of taking like a semester or a year-long course on Tolkien's work is fine if you're taking like if you have an interest in literature. I think that's fine. Um, it's the point where it crosses into the real world and it becomes your reference point that's problematic, or a reference point for everything rather. It's okay to reference a few things back to it, but don't like let not do not let that be your only reference point back into the real world. That
Okay.
is my main problem. I mean, I took a semester's long course on Dante's Divine Comedy, and I mean that was very informative in terms of just like, first of all, the beauty and the structure of the literary work itself, but also um, some ideas of like late medieval Italian piety, right?
Yeah.
Um, and their idea of the divine cosmology, and how like where Earth is in relation to heaven, hell, and purgatory, and like what how you get through those. Even though Dante doesn't follow a strictly correct or Orthodox Catholic view of uh, hell and purgatory and heaven. But it's still interesting to see how people thought about it back then,
Yeah. So I've
600 years ago or so.
yeah. So I have a question for you. What exactly do you mean by reference point?
Well, I mean, it's just kind of like, I mean, there's like an entire meme page, which I admittedly follow, like, um, Lord of the Rings memes for like ring bearing teens or
Oh
whatever.
gosh.
Um, that's probably not the actual name, because they don't pay me to do promotions. Um, but basically, the entire meme page is like fan submissions from people who follow the page, and it's always referencing with Lord of the Rings back to like, oh, the orcs are like the purple-haired feminists of today, or like the orc invasions are like we should let the orcs in because they'll make us more diverse and multicultural.
Oh gosh.
Um,
Yeah.
and whenever like a Lord of the Rings character says something about, like the orcs are invading or they're like pillaging Rohan, like another character like Legolas might say something like that, and then Aragorn will turn back. He's like, Legolas, that's very narrow-minded of you. Or reproach him for being intolerant or of diversity, and it'll always be like a drawing back to the current like push for multiculturalism or the current push for diversity, um,
Interesting.
and things like that. And it's just like people use these memes like in their internet conversations. They might share them and things like that, but you don't see similar things. Like I'm okay. Like I think the memes are funny. I really do. But you don't see meme pages that have that much dedication and that much volume of content, um, for like the Iliad, for example, right? And
Yeah.
but the Iliad is a or the Odyssey, or
Yes.
or even like the Socratic dialogues, or Aristotle. I mean, there is so much meme content that could be made with the Socratic dialogues alone. I mean, there are pages for this, but it's such an underutilized resource. And I mean, you'd show a meme about Socratic dialogues to most people in the so-called traditionalist sphere, and they'd kind of give you a blank stare and they wouldn't get it. But you show them a Lord of the Rings meme, and everyone starts rolling on the ground laughing.
Yeah. Interesting.
And that's not because Lord of the Rings memes are necessarily better than, for example, a Socratic meme. It's just because people aren't as familiar with the writings of Plato as they are with Lord of the Rings. Their reference point is the Lord of the Rings, in much the same way that for a liberal person, their reference point is Harry Potter.
Hmm.
And again, I say pick up another book. There's other good literature out there. Diversify.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's a good point.
and and may your memes be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah, I think that might just be a problem with meme culture in general. Uh, like I don't know. I'm not into meme culture, so I can't really say, but I get that memes are funny, which is good, and it's okay to use them for that purpose. But I don't think I think I think the reason why more serious books like the Socratic dialogues and Aristotle and Odyssey and Iliad and all that, I think the reason why perhaps they don't take on so much, they aren't referenced in meme culture so much, is probably a number one. They're just more remote time wise. Like Lord of the Rings is just more recent. But number two, I think like they're just more serious. I guess I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know about that, because you have to remember, like, The Lord of the Rings was specifically written by Tolkien not to be a work of fantasy, like pure fantasy, the way Narnia is. But it's written in a way that it's supposed to resemble an orally recounted myth that has been written down by someone. And it's
Yeah.
supposed to resemble something like Beowulf or the Iliad or the Odyssey, just in the way that it's written.
Yeah.
And that's why people like George R. R. Martin, when he criticizes Tolkien for not being in depth enough, where he's like, when I read the Lord of the Rings, I always wondered what was Aragorn's tax policy. It's like that's not the point of the book or the literary style. The point is Aragorn was a good king. That is a perfectly fine ending for the type of book that Tolkien wrote, and that's convey a moral message, convey an epic journey, and you will find exactly the same thing in ancient literature as well. You don't like when you read the Iliad or the Odyssey, you don't hear about Agamemnon's tax policy, or you don't hear about like the annual revenue generated by Odysseus's vineyard.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's just easy to um, yeah, I really don't know.
I mean, I guess part of the problem is just in the very concept of a meme.
Yeah.
It's something that a meme is a cultural element that a lot of people understand and latch onto.
Yeah, I mean it's a
And
yeah.
the more people that latch onto it and make reference to it, the more potent the meme.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean
so
it's
if it becomes the only thing that people reference back everything back to, then it's a very powerful meme. And it's sort of like the failure with it built into the system. But at the same time, we have to remember that like for at least 2,000 years, actually more than that, like 2,300 years, um, since Homer condensed the Iliad or the Iliad and the Odyssey, um, from oral retellings. Um, the Iliad and the Odyssey were the memes of the day. Everyone referenced back to them. In fact, today during Latin class, I was reading or translating an epitaph of a Polish knight who died in Serbia in the 15th century, and it was sort of like his tombstone marking, if you will. And it's a very long poem written in Latin by a Polish poet. Um, and it keeps referencing back to how this knight is like Achilles or how he's like Odysseus or Ajax.
wow.
And he died fighting the Turks, but instead the Turks are referenced to as like Thracians and Phrygians, which are people that would be familiar to a reader of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah.
And so like since the times of Homer into like the late Middle Ages and beyond, like Homer was the meme. I mean, alongside other things, but I mean, like in terms of literature, like Homer has just as much potential to be a cultural reference point as The Lord of the Rings, if not more. I mean, it certainly has a longer track record, but that's more to do with the fact that Homer lived in the 8th century BC, whereas Tolkien lived in the 20th. But
Yeah, interesting.
it still shows that there is a lot of reference power in Homer in these ancient or older works. And I'm certain like just as people can find humor in the Lord of the Rings, I'm certain they could find them in these ancient sources too.
Yeah. That's an interesting point.
I mean,
Yeah. I,
at the same time, I mean, you have to remember like there are great. I keep going back to like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, but I mean there is great meme potential just in their names alone. Like Socrates and Plato were like Socrates was a soldier. Plato, I believe, means like broad-shouldered in Greek, if I remember, which is probably like his wrestling name.
hmm.
Um, And I mean, like you could just imagine this is from an actual meme that I saw. You could just imagine Aristotle disagreeing with Plato in class one day, and Plato just like completely flexing on him to intimidate him.
uh, yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe it might be good to go on a slight tangent on meme culture in general, because I know it's the meme is it's a analog for Gene that was first brought up by Dawkins. I think it was Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Richard Dawkins, cursed be his name.
yeah, so he came up with the concept, and I don't know that it's really like that good of a an analog to, like, I don't think it's really representative of what goes on in a cultural sense. Like, I think people sort of latch on to that idea of like this really short um, uh, building block of culture that everybody knows. Um, like, maybe I don't know. Maybe perhaps the reason, perhaps like it's right in a sense. Um, I think maybe the reason why uh, meme culture. I think honestly, I think the rise of social media and all of that has, and Reddit has accelerated this idea and sort of made it possible for people to um, follow it. But I don't know that it's really like applicable to. I don't know that the term is applicable to works. Um, is really applicable to like cultural a cultural awareness, I guess, if that makes sense. Like I think uh,
Well,
number.
that's Dawkins' original definition of the word meme. It's just a cultural reference point, not like a funny image. It was just the term meme was applied to funny images because funny images became cultural reference points. As
Yeah,
people shared them on the internet, people became familiar with certain formats like Doge and Virgin versus Chad
yeah,
and other ones.
yeah. Interesting. I guess maybe. Um, yeah, maybe just the fact that that Lord of the Rings is such a popular was such a popular book and is like a lot well more known. It leads to the fact that and the fact that Tolkien was Catholic. I don't know. Maybe that. I guess it's not a bad reference point for traditionalists, but yeah, as you're saying, it shouldn't be the only one. I just don't know. I still don't know. I would have to look into Dawkins' definition of meme. I just when I think of meme, I think of like meme culture, not really something of a cultural reference point. So to hear like when you talk about how um, uh, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they were like a meme to the Greece of the time. That sounds a little weird to me because like I feel obviously like it was a cultural reference point for them, and they probably knew it backwards and forwards. Um, but I think it's definitely a very different sense of the word than most people would think of. And when you if you said
yeah, for
meme to them.
sure, for sure, for sure. I mean, no one was like reading the Iliad and like inscribing LOL into like a marble tablet or something and then sending it to their friend. Um,
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing too is maybe the fact that memes has sort of morphed into this into some things that are funny, like things that you attach LOL to the end of. Maybe it's just a reflection of the fact that our culture just seeks entertainment as a cultural thing rather than um, uh,
well, it's interesting because we've sort of gone from like I guess what I would call high memes to like low memes, where originally like a cultural reference point would be like an entire literary work, like the Homeric cycle, uh, where people would just like understand references to the general literary works of Homer or some other text. or artwork or whatever. Um, and but now it's become people understand, they know the Lord of the Rings, but they don't like quote the Lord of the Rings. Like if I were to quote some kind of a phrase from the Lord of the Rings in conversation, chances are people wouldn't pick up on it. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
but
Go ahead, sir.
instead what has become a meme are like snapshots from like the Lord of the Rings films, the film trilogy, along with a funny text that references a situation from the film or from the books. And it's so you're no longer referencing the literary work itself, you're referencing like a very, very minute part of it that everyone might be familiar with.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think just in that distinction between like high memes and low memes, I think I think works of like these works like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they weren't intended merely for entertainment purposes. Like I think they were intended as sort of a myth, which is sort of meant to be a constructive thing in terms of like uh, it's meant to increase your piety maybe towards the gods. It's meant to elevate your thinking. It's meant to do more than just merely entertain. And
Right. I mean, for centuries, the Iliad and the Odyssey were read by the ancient Greeks as sort of how an example or examples of how to be a Greek aristocratic man.
yeah, and I know like
Um,
another example would be
and
Handel's Messiah, which is like someone said, "Oh, well, this is such a great work, and thank you for entertaining us." To Handel, and he's like, "Oh, well, I hoped I had done more than entertain. I wish to make them better." So,
mhm.
like that's kind of the point of a lot of these works, and like as you were just saying, even less than 500 years ago is they're meant to be constructive, not merely to entertain. And I feel like our culture, when it searches for books, when it searches for movies or whatever, like it's just the entertainment value that matters. And I think
Yeah, well, I think the idea that like both high memes and low memes are cultural reference points and cultural building blocks, but they build perhaps two different kinds of cultures. High memes, which sort of look at literary works for as they are, the big picture of the literary work, the grand narrative behind it, what it's supposed to teach or convey. And then, in that sense, like the Iliad and the Odyssey are building blocks for example, ancient Greek society, but also beyond that, just generally Indo-European society of the pre-revolutionary era. Um, but and then you have low memes, which go into like the details of these literary works, and they pick out the entertaining bits, and they become cultural reference points and cultural building points too. But they become cultural reference points and building blocks of a culture that is built for the purpose of entertainment. It's like a culture of entertainment and amusement rather than a culture of looking for strong moral messages, guidelines, and examples to follow.
yeah, yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, and I mean taking this back to like Lord of the Rings, I guess Lord of the Rings, having read it, I would say, yeah, it's an epic work, but at the same time, a it's not really written in the same way. It's not really written as a um, model for behavior. I guess is it's not written as a sort of a myth for contemporary society because he was Catholic and Tolkien was Catholic,
Well,
And
Well, I disagree. I think that there is that sort of culture building value to it. It's not just entertainment,
right,
but we've made it that way. We've made
yeah,
it just about entertainment.
yeah.
Um,
I guess that makes
and but I
sense.
mean, on the other hand, I mean, people who get into the Lord of the Rings for entertainment value because they've seen the funny pictures on the internet or whatever, can then actually read the Lord of the Rings. They can be, you know, enticed to actually pick up the book, read it, and find something deeper. And in that way, that can actually be constructive. It's just like it it is very limiting if that is the only book they ever pick up.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I guess what I'm saying is like I feel like it's influenced by the it's definitely a novel. Like it's in the genre of novels, and as such, it tends more to um, entertainment, and yeah, it is a very deep book. Like I'm not gonna lie, I we just finished watching the movie, and the most one of the most epic scenes is when Theoden comes up with the Riders of Rohan, about to um, they see the Battle of Minas Tirith going on below, and Theoden gives this very stirring speech about how a spear shall be shaken, shield shall be broken, swords. I don't know. I don't remember it exactly, but the point is, he and his 600 horsemen were about to give their lives for a hopeless cause, basically, because the army of Minas Tirith was just way too large for them to defeat on their own. And so he goes, once his speech is done, he just screams death, and then everyone behind him screams death, and then he screams death, and then obviously we know that Theoden eventually ends up dying in that battle, and it's just like, wow, like that's just a very very powerful scene. So yeah, and I cried at that. So there are very like, it is the book and the movie has some very um, constructive, very constructive scenes, very deep scenes. It's just it feels a lot different than the Iliad or the Odyssey. I guess um, I can't exactly explain it. Like it just the Iliad and the Lord of the Rings feels like it fits into into it fits more easily into the culture. Like it's easier to read somehow than the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I don't know how to explain that. Um,
Well, that might be because the Iliad and the Odyssey are originally written in epic verse, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean that's a good point too. Like it was a poem, and yeah, it was meant to be. It was sort of like the um, the cultural reference point for the Greeks. The sort of like example of how to fight in a battle, how to live one's life, how to be, in the case of the Odyssey, like how to how to be faithful to the gods and to your husband slash wife. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, it just
But I mean, the thing is, like, nowhere in there is it explicitly said, this is what you will do to honor the gods, or this is what you will do to be a good Greek man. No, the Greeks when they read the Odyssey, they had to read into the characters what they were doing and whether or not this was an appropriate way to behave.
well,
So
here's
I
the
mean,
yeah
they it wasn't spelled out for them in black and white. They had to interpret the work too in a
yeah
way that I think probably could be done with the Lord of the Rings. It's just that we've become so accustomed to reading novels that we also are accustomed to reading Lord of the Rings of the novel as a novel, um, and to read it that way. That's why no one understands the chapter about Tom Bombadil because it makes no sense in a novel. But if you read it as a work of folk mythology, a some as basically a written down version of an an oral tradition of a myth of an epic tale like Beowulf, or the Iliad or the Odyssey, then sometimes with oral retellings you get these random little bits of mythology, these short little stories, these characters that no one remembers what purpose they serve. Sometimes they serve no purpose at all, and but they're still in there. And I think Beowulf is more of a better example than the Iliad or the Odyssey for this. But I mean, like you do get that in these myths, and that's why when people read The Lord of the Rings as just like a pure novel rather than a novel pretending to be a myth, then they get confused.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the difference. Yeah, I think the difference. I think I got it. I think the difference between the Iliad and the Odyssey and Lord of the Rings is that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written to be believed, in terms of like all the gods doing this and that. Like it was written for people to believe that that was actually what happened, and also it was written um, on the back of a lot of as you said, oral retelling. So it wasn't just an original. It wasn't a completely original story. It was it was drawn from oral retellings of the actual Battle of Troy, um, or I don't know about the Odyssey, but um, and then with Lord of the Rings, as you said, it's a novel pretending to be a myth, and but it's not meant to be believed as a real um, as something that really happened, I guess. And yes, it is, and I think um, another difference too between the two of them that I think is especially important is that because the Iliad and the Odyssey were meant to be believed, they were part of the actual world view of everyone who was of the Greeks, whereas with Tolkien he had to invent a fantasy world that is not actually part of our world, and it's clear that is not part of our world. So
Well, actually, I mean, Tolkien, I think, makes it pretty explicit that Middle Earth is simply the Earth in a very, very, distant past.
okay, um, yeah, I mean,
Um,
yeah, but it's still um, it's still clearly fantasy, I guess. Like I don't know, like it's
yes, of course. I mean, but then again, you do get like sea goddesses intervening in the world of the Iliad, right? Um,
yeah,
or
but
gods descending from Olympus.
right. Um, but people would have believed that. I feel like.
True, true.
So I don't know. I don't know what that difference portends exactly, but I think that is a major difference because the a novel is clearly meant to be fictitious, whereas um, the myths are not meant to be fictitious. And Tolkien, yes, as you're saying, he was trying to write a sort of universal myth, but it's still a novel, and I think that might be um, why it appeals more to people now, because just reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, you get just this sense that there's such a clash of worldviews. There's such a difference between that worldview and whatever worldview of the person who's reading it now, because it's just so the gods of Olympus and all of that are just so obsolete compared to whatever people believe now, outside of maybe a few pagans, but other than those, so that might be maybe perhaps the barrier that that is there for reading these old works. And another thing, just entertainment. Again, this culture of entertainment. It is difficult to pick up a book like the Iliad and the Odyssey purely for entertainment, and I feel like it's easier to do that with the Lord of the Rings, um, just because. Yeah.
I agree. I agree with that second point. But I do think that your first point is a little superficial because the idea that like the Iliad and the Odyssey no longer have anything to tell us in the 21st century because they're not as culturally relevant as the Lord of the Rings. Um, I don't think I agree with. I mean,
No, no, no. So that's
the
not what I'm
Iliad and the
saying.
Odyssey.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just
Well,
saying
I mean
it's.
that's kind of like what I extrapolated from what you were
Sorry,
saying.
sorry. Let me clarify then. I'm not saying it's obsolete in the sense that I'm not saying it shouldn't be read or that it doesn't have anything to offer. I'm just saying that if you take the worldview of a particular person in our society today, I would argue it's harder for them to pick that book up than Lord of the Rings,
Well,
just
yeah,
because.
but for what reason? Because it's no longer relevant for most people, as most people see it. I'm not
Yes,
saying that that's the view that you have, but most people think that it's obsolete.
yes, exactly.
Or
Yeah,
that, but the thing is, like, if you're someone who has a traditional worldview, like many people
yes,
who are dedicated fans of the Lord of the Rings, um, if you have a traditional worldview, then we have to realize that things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also other ancient works, profoundly impacted the ancient Greeks for more than 800 years since Homer, until the time of Christ, and then after the time of Christ, or during the time of Christ, during the Christian era, um, it continued to be relevant until, like I said, the 15th century and beyond. And the reason for that is because if we want to reconstruct a traditional worldview for our people. In my case, I mean, in both of our cases, we are both from European extraction.
mm-hmm.
Um, if we want to reconstruct not just a religious worldview, but just like a cultural worldview as well, that is appropriate to our ancestors, then we also need to look at the literature of our ancestors. And when we look at how the Europeans treated the Iliad and the Odyssey, we can see that even though it's an originally pagan work, it continued to be relevant and celebrated by the Europeans throughout the entire era of what we now know as Christendom. And it wasn't until the age of the Enlightenment and the age of rationalism that it actually lost the traction that it had. And that's because the age of rationalism killed something in the traditional European culture, and that something is something that the Christian Europeans shared even with their pagan ancestors. And I think that's sort of the same aristocratic warrior values of honor, dedication, and bravery and strength that are just they transcend the pagan Christian divide and are just something that is at the heart of what it means to be a European. And so for people who have a dedication to European culture, not just Christian culture generally, but specifically Christian European culture, looking to the Iliad and the Odyssey and gaining something from it, gleaning some kind of moral message about how to live one's life from it, is part of the way to reclaim their Christian heritage as well, their Christian European identity.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, and I would say like again with respect to the Age of Enlightenment, I don't think it's an accident that the novel appeared like right after that period, and you also have Grimm's fairy tales as well that appeared during that period, and I think it's as you said, the Enlightenment kind of killed something. It killed with the deism of the Enlightenment, the idea that God no longer works in the world, like he just sort of set it in motion, but doesn't no longer cares about what happens. I think that sort of eliminates this sort of and this idea of the grand arc of history. This sort of inevitable um, inevitable uh, um,
Progress.
progress, right? That happens that you see Kant argue for, and Hegel. Um, it sort of people sort of needed stories to turn to in order to sort of regain something, because regain regain the story of life, I guess, because like life is a story. It's supposed to be a story. There's nothing inevitable about it. It's all of us are actors in it, but this sort of this again, this deism and the inevitable progress of history, it kind of killed that idea. Like, oh, what is one person going to do to stop this progress? Nothing. It's, you
Well,
know, as long as you
well,
just as long as you're a faithful Christian, and you've you know, you're gonna make it. Um, so there's no
well, I don't,
longer
I
any.
don't know if that's, I
Yeah, go
don't know
ahead.
if I would agree with that interpretation because we have to remember, like, it's highly questionable whether or not the Greeks believed that anyone was an actor in the world, really. A big part of Greek tragedy is the idea that you can't escape fate.
Yeah,
That no matter how much you try, your actions are still guided by the gods, so that you will fulfill your fate against all of your other, wishes. I mean, just look at Oedipus, right?
mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't think that this idea that, Enlightenment deism uniquely frees people from being actors in the world, it really holds, because we see the same thing in ancient Greek literature, except it goes to the other extreme where no one is an actor, everything is guided by the gods. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
it's just like,
yeah, it's sort of
I,
like,
I would
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I would say what the Enlightenment really did to the European spirit is that through rationalism and demystifying the world and turning everything into a sort of rationalistic calculation, it became very economical. Life became very, very economical, very materialistic, and it brought the European man away from spiritual values, imponderables, we would say, like honor, courage, dedication, loyalty, um, a place in man's place in the universe, in the hierarchy of being, as well as in the hierarchy of his other men. Um, and it moved what was traditionally a society of warriors and priests to a society of merchants and bureaucrats.
Yeah, yeah, I mean,
And that is really what killed the European spirit. And I think if we want to be what Europeans were traditionally, before they kind of got this terminal illness that we're kind of in the death throes of right now, then we have to go back to what Europeans were for the first 3 or 4 thousand years of the existence of European civilization, which is the archetype of the warrior and of the priest, not of the merchant and the bureaucrat. And one way to do that is to reach back to the literature that has inspired our ancestors for 2,000 years or more.
yeah, great point. Yeah, I was sort of speaking off the top of my head, so maybe, I don't know. I do feel like deism is somehow connected the with the sprouting of novels and fairy tales, um, which don't really have any reference to God, usually. Um, it's so, um, I don't know. Yeah, I really don't know exactly what the connection between them. I don't know what exactly is there, but I feel like they are connected somehow. And novels are great. Don't get me wrong. Like, I've read a ton of novels. That was like literally all I did as a kid. Um, but yeah, they miss something deeper that in reality. Like, I feel like they miss God's providence over everything, and sort of make it out to be more of a, yeah, more of a, just a materialistic, not atheistic, but sort of, yeah, deistic conception of reality, where God isn't really present, and we as a we have to sort of work things out on our own. And yeah, I mean, so in that sense, like, there are novels that are good. Don't get me wrong. There are novels that you should pick up and read. But as Jacob just said, if we really want to regain the European Christian identity of our ancestors, in our cases, then and really Christianity is so bound up with European history that it's almost, yeah, that it. I mean, you can be Christian obviously and not know anything about Europeans, but um, they're just so bound up with each other that going back and reading the books of their time, the books that were honored during that time, is an essential step towards regaining, towards promoting traditionalism as a concept. And to do that, you have to. Lord of the Rings is a great start. I feel like for people maybe listening to this podcast who have never read a novel, never really really yeah, Lord of the Rings could be a gateway towards um, Iliad and the Odyssey, but it shouldn't be the stopping point. And that I think that also applies to a lot of novels as well, even Catholic novels. Like read some of the great writers of the past 200 years, but also read, the Iliad and the Odyssey and the great books of that time, and that will, yeah, that will definitely broaden your worldview and give you a different reference point as well. All right, so it's almost time for us to finish, but I would like to end maybe with some book suggestions for people, in terms of what we've been talking about. So, Jacob, do you have any book recommendations? Obviously, the Iliad and Odyssey, but anything else?
Um, so obviously the Iliad and the Odyssey, um, Beowulf probably. In terms of books that aren't in themselves grand works of literature, but could probably help someone who's new to the idea understand their value. I would recommend Dominique Veneer's The Shock of History. That is one book that really sort of opened my eyes to the value of the Homeric cycle. Um, where he basically Veneer was a figure of the French, let's say far right, um, and he was culturally Catholic, but he was not a believing Catholic. He it is The Shock of History is a last interview that he conducted, um, before he unfortunately committed suicide. Um, and in that book, he does write that for him personally, um, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the primary book on how to be a European, and for him as a non-believing cultural Christian or cultural Catholic, the Iliad and the Odyssey are actually above the Bible on his list of most important books. Something that I don't personally agree with, but that's just something that is worthy of consideration. That that they could even be put on a comparable level.
Yeah,
Um, in terms of how important they are. Of course, Dominique Veneer looks at it from a very sort of their value for uh, being a European culturally rather than their value for someone's spiritual salvation. Obviously, the Bible is more important in that regard, and probably in regard to in regard to culture as well. But it is still a testament to how important that they are to being a European in general.
yeah,
Um, Other than that, probably the Arthurian legends as well. Um,
I have not read those yet.
uh, La Morte de Arthur.
I have that book on my bookshelf. Yeah, I just haven't read it. That's a good one. That is a good one though. And
Also,
Dante's.
probably a lot of Greek tragedies.
Yeah, like Euripides and Euripides tragedies and Well, Dante's Inferno too, or Dante's.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The Divine Comedy. Don't just stop with the Inferno.
As I
I
did.
know the Inferno is I know the Inferno is really cool because you get to like see all the sinners burning in hell,
Oh
and
my
it's really
gosh.
kind of like gory and epic, but um don't stop at the Inferno. In terms of theological insight and cosmological insight, I do think that Purgatorio and Paradiso are just as, if not more, valuable.
Yeah,
Um,
I need to read those. Yeah. I think on my end, I would say I know Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is regarded as kind of in the canon. I've only read like maybe one or two of them though, so I couldn't really say for sure. Um, there's obviously Shakespeare. I think he's. I haven't read a lot of. I've seen some of the plays. I haven't. I've read a little bit, not all of them. But those are good reading too. Um, and I would say my favorite author of all time, besides God and in the Bible, my favorite author of all time is G.K. Chesterton. He was a lived in the born in the 19th century, wrote a lot in the 20th century, and he has a ton of books that are really great. He converted to Catholicism. Um, I think his Father Brown series, which is about this priest who is kind of a detective, is better than Sherlock Holmes. It's just one of the greatest series that I've read, and gives a lot. It's very snappy. Gives a lot of uh, it's very moral. The morals are very clear. It has great, yeah. It just has great morals for each of the stories. Besides him, I would say Father Robert Hugh Benson is also good. He wrote the first dystopian novel, Lord of the World, and he also wrote Come Rat, Come Rope, which is about a priest during the not Victorian, priest during the Elizabethan crackdown on Catholics in the 1590s, about a priest who ends up on the rack. Um, and yeah, I mean, obviously Lord of the Rings, and then um, oh shoot, what's his name? Um, there's Flannery O'Connor too, who wrote a lot of really good short stories that are really depressing. So I don't know if you they're a little out there. But she was Catholic, and then there's also dang it, the writer of oh shoot, I'm not remembering his name. Um, yeah, and then obviously C.S. Lewis. I've read Narnia. I know I'm a heretic on this, but I think Narnia is actually better than Lord of the Rings. I've read Narnia series over 25 times myself. I read it a ton as a kid, and his other books are also really great, especially his space trilogy. Um, and yeah, I there are probably websites out there that have other good Catholic books, good books by Christians, Catholics, and all of that. So, Dickens is also another good one, especially his Christmas Carol and Tale of Two Cities. And yeah, I think that's about it. Any more from you, Jacob?
um, if we want to go into like more modern authors, I haven't actually read this one, but I have I've been getting into um Lawrence of Arabia.
Interesting. I have not
Just
read that.
the general topic of the man's life. Very interesting man. A British officer during World War One who ended up leading the Arab rebellion against the Ottomans, and the reason why we have countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, uh, Palestine, and Syria today. Um,
Wow.
he wrote a book titled Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which is basically his biographical account of of his participation in the Arab Ottoman War. And I think if you look at what type of man he was, um, that is a very good sort of hero figure for any young man who's looking for some kind of a role model.
All right, so get off Reddit, put down your copy of Lord of the Rings, and go read some of these books. I think
Yeah,
that's or
or start an uprising of Arabs against whoever. But
uh,
that's an option too.
okay, yeah, that's do both. You can even do both. All right, well, I think that's about it. That wasn't time for my presentation, which is on the Gelasian diarchy, which might be a good thing because I don't know how popular that is. I don't know if people stay awake for that, but yeah, I think that'll be about it. So we'll finish with the random number generator to see what our next topic will be. Let me just pull up the questions here. Okay. All right, here we go. Three. All right, what is three? Oh, that's William. Are sports a good use of time? That's a good one. Um, and I'm gonna get roasted for that one because I'm a sportsaholic myself. All right. Well, with that, we will finish, and God bless.